me back up a second. Before we go through, I've got a list of my sort of strengths and weaknesses that I think we see in Israeli startups. But before we get there, one quick thought that comes up a lot. Entrepreneurship, that creativity, and I mentioned this before, the creativity and the drive to do something and to be creative and to get something out is not the same as innovation. Okay? Entrepreneurship is about coming up with an idea, having the energy, saying, wouldn't it be great if? Innovation is about making it happen. And there are three things that are a challenge for any startup, in particular for Israeli startups. The first is product-oriented. You come up with something new, exciting, original, something that is just, you think is cutting edge, right? It's going to get investors to go nuts about it. But then you've got to stop and say, 1 second, how am I going to make this useful, appropriate to the audience, very focused? How am I going to define it? And to an extent, it means I've got to limit sometimes some of the excitement and some of the power that I've been, imagining for this. So that's product-oriented, is taking this big idea and bringing it to something practical. The second is the tools that you use. The minute that you decide on building software or any kind of a product, really, using a particular, if it's actual hardware, you have supplies that you have to be able to get, affordably, cheaply. If it's a website or an app, it's got to be using a particular code or not. For instance, this is getting a little bit detailed, but if you're building an app for an iPhone, you can either build it using Apple's toolkit, making it an actual app or an Android, whatever it is, making it a native app, or you can use what's called a browser envelope, where it really is a website and it works within a browser, but you don't know, but the user doesn't know the difference, right? He launches this thing, which is really opening up a little website, and that website is doing the heavy lifting over on the web server, right? It's not happening on your phone itself. That decision, which way to go, whether to build your app native using its tools, which can then use all the phones, the camera and the button and the GPS and all that stuff, versus, and if you do that, you have to build one for Android, one for iPhone, one for iPads, one for Samsung. You have to build them for each thing individually because it's the code built for each app. A company has to decide whether to do that or to build one that happens in a browser, and then all you need is one version, and it resizes and it reshapes depending on what you're doing. Those decisions, taking your product that you see and deciding what tools to use, is the second thing that comes up a lot in general for startups, and for Israelis in particular, have a little bit of trouble sort of, deciding where the limitation is going to be, where they're going to invest their time. The last, again, is really about culture. You want to have a company where people can be creative, can be fluid, can come up with new ideas, can think out of the box. But at the same time, you've got to be productive. At Answers.com, our CEO loved to have company meetings where everybody would toss up their best 10 ideas for the product. And we would come up with a lot of really great ideas, and a lot of the time they would make their ways into the product, and it would be great. The problem is that if you do the math, you have 45 people in the company, you figure out what each one of them gets paid per month, per year, per hour, and you realize each one of these company meetings costs us $15,000. And you got to wonder whether the productivity that's lost, without having, involved in having everybody there, makes sense. And the good side, Israeli companies are very inclusive, love to have everybody involved in discussions. The flip side, sometimes they get carried away, and the level of efficiency and the quality of the kind of the productive mindset sometimes gets a little bit sacrificed there. So that's kind of sort of just the big picture. So let's get a little more specific now about Israeli strengths. Okay? Here are the 6 core strengths that I've found over and over again through the companies that I've either worked directly with as an employee, as a manager, or that I'm working with now as an advisor. Number 1 by far is the pivot. Okay? The pivot is, the idea of a pivot is changing direction. Is saying, this isn't quite working, or the dream that we have is a little bit overshot, or the way that we've been presenting this really isn't moving along. We're gonna have to gut a lot of the stuff that we have and kind of pivot, twist, and do something different. What's interesting here, compared to Silicon Valley, is that there's no stigma attached to the pivot. There's no sense of, well, you guys didn't think this through, you guys screwed this up, you gambled, you lost, So now you're kind of scrambling to do something else. It's actually an initial, almost accepted part of the plan that you're going to have this pivot. If you have on your resume that you worked at these 3 companies, and during that a couple of them have been failed startups, people don't hold that against you. People like the idea that you've been experimenting and testing and kind of doing, getting exposure to all different types of businesses. I was working with a company called Bite to Eat. I was actually, a partner and I actually were trying to run it for about a year. And it was essentially it was an online ordering company where you take your menu, you fax it to us, we would digitize it, put it online for you in case you didn't have your own website or ordering system, and people at could order from your restaurant. We learned a lot. I learned a lot about funding. I learned about how accountants work, about how accountants can kind of mess with your head, make you do things that you wouldn't otherwise do. Learned about customer service. I mean, I could give you a checklist of 30 things that I didn't know before that I got from running this company. Now, in the end, the technology was not quickly developed enough. We had the business side all set. We had restaurants set up. Technology was lagging behind, and we actually ran out of funds, and the whole thing got shut down, which was painful. I can tell you it was traumatic for us. However, I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. And if you talk to anyone who's run a startup here, you'd probably get the same answer, because you get that grounding, the notion of changing gears, tossing something out. Even for the investor, if someone fails in an investment, specifically the Israeli mindset is it makes it kind of like a gambling thing in Vegas. It makes you want to put more money into the next one to make back what you made before, because you've got that confidence that the next one's going to work because you learned something the time before. So that's the pivot. Now, the next thing is in the last 10 years there's been a dramatic change in Israeli companies.